Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
There are certain names in football hooligan history that have become almost impossible to forget. Men whose reputations spread far beyond the clubs they followed, becoming recognised not just by their own firm, but by rivals across the country. Some achieved notoriety through newspaper headlines, others through books, documentaries, and television interviews. Their stories have been told and retold so many times that they have become part of football folklore. Then there are the men who left almost nothing behind. No television appearances, no newspaper interviews, no autobiography explaining their side of the story. Hardly any photographs, barely any personal details. No record of where they came from, how they grew up, or even how they lost the injury that would define the way thousands of football supporters remembered him forever. Yet somehow, despite all of that, almost every serious football hooligan from the late 1970s and 1980s knew exactly who he was. His name was Babs, or, as almost everybody knew him, one-armed Babs. Ask 10 Chelsea supporters from that era about him, and you'll probably hear 10 different stories. Some have undoubtedly grown with the passing decades. Others have been exaggerated until fact and folklore became almost impossible to separate. Like so many legendary terrace figures, the truth has gradually become buried beneath hundreds of retellings, each adding another layer to the myth. But strip away the rumours, the embellishments, and the stories that became larger with every telling, and one fact remains remarkably consistent. Everybody respected him, not because he shouted the loudest, not because he claimed to be the hardest, but because, according to almost everyone who stood beside him or against him, he simply never backed down. It almost sounds impossible. At a time when English football was descending into some of the most violent years in its history, one of the most feared men on the terraces was missing an arm. To most people, that should have been an obvious disadvantage. Football violence in the 70s and 80s was brutal, unpredictable, and often completely chaotic. Fights could erupt in packed railway stations, outside pubs, on moving trains, inside stadiums, or in narrow back streets where there was nowhere to escape. Success often depended on numbers, mobility, and sheer physicality. Yet somehow, in that world, one-armed Babs earned a reputation that extended far beyond Stamford Bridge. Supporters from West Ham knew his name. Millwall knew his name. Tottenham knew his name. Manchester United supporters sang about him. Long before social media, before mobile phones, and before endless football documentaries, stories travelled remarkably quickly. Every away trip created another tale. Every confrontation added another chapter. Every season the legend grew. Soon, rival supporters who had never actually met Babs believed they already knew him. Rumours spread that he had replaced his missing arm with a steel hook. Others insisted he had a detachable prosthetic which he used in fights. Some claimed he hid weapons beneath his coat. The stories became increasingly unbelievable, fueled by away day gossip and the kind of exaggeration that has always surrounded football folklore. Those who genuinely knew him dismissed much of it. Most insisted they had never once seen him wearing a prosthetic arm at football. There was no hook, no secret weapon, just a stocky Chelsea supporter who refused to let a disability define him. If anything, many believed losing an arm had made him even more determined to prove himself. One Chelsea supporter, who later became friends with Babs, described him in surprisingly ordinary terms. Away from football, he wasn't constantly looking for confrontation. He was cheerful, friendly, easy to talk to. The sort of bloke who would ask how you were getting on and what you'd been up to since the last match. He always seemed approachable, never acting like the mythical figure his reputation suggested. But Saturday afternoons were different. Football transformed people. By the late 70s, English football had developed its own unwritten hierarchy. Every club had its characters. Every city had names that carried weight. Certain individuals became recognised not through official positions, but because people naturally gravitated towards them. Leadership wasn't elected, it was earned. Chelsea had several respected figures during this period, but Babs occupied a unique place among them. He wasn't simply another member of the Shed Boys. He became one of the men others instinctively looked towards when things turned ugly. That wasn't something you could fake. Reputations on the terraces were brutally honest. If someone claimed to be fearless but disappeared whenever trouble arrived, word spread quickly. If someone hid behind others while encouraging everyone else forward, people noticed. Respect wasn't built on stories. It was built on consistency, and Babs seemed to possess that quality in abundance. Former Chelsea supporters repeatedly used the same word when describing him. Game. It's a simple expression, but within football culture, it carried enormous meaning. Being game didn't necessarily mean you always won. It didn't mean you never got hurt. It certainly didn't mean you couldn't be outnumbered. It meant that when things went wrong, when everyone else hesitated, you still stood your ground. That description appears again and again whenever people remember Babs. He'd back down from no one. He was game as anything. He'd have a tear up with anybody. Those comments come from different people, different years, and different circumstances. The consistency is difficult to ignore. His appearance only added to his reputation. Supporters remembered him as a stocky figure who dressed sharply, like many Chelsea lads of the era. During colder months, he was often seen wearing a green combat jacket. In other photographs and memories, people recall him wearing jeans, polo necks, or sheepskin coats, always looking smart without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. Then there was the missing arm. Nobody seemed to dwell on it. Nobody who actually knew him treated it as his defining feature. Instead, they remembered the confidence with which he carried himself, almost as though it simply wasn't relevant. Perhaps that's what unsettled opponents the most. When rival firms first noticed him, many probably assumed he would stay towards the back, protected by others. Instead, he usually did the exact opposite. Time and again, witnesses describe Babs moving towards confrontation rather than away from it, stepping forward, calling people out, standing where everyone could see him. There are countless stories from football's violent past that have become impossible to verify, but one incident appears in enough independent accounts that it has become almost inseparable from Babs's legacy. The challenge to Bill Gardner. During the height of the rivalry between Chelsea and West Ham, Gardner had already established himself as one of the intercity firm's most respected figures. Both firms carried enormous reputations, and meetings between them were rarely accidental. Whenever Chelsea and West Ham crossed paths, everyone expected trouble. On one such occasion, after the match had finished, both mobs eventually found themselves facing one another. The atmosphere changed instantly. Nobody needed instructions. Nobody needed encouraging. Both sides already knew why they were there. Then Babs stepped forward. Across the road stood dozens of West Ham's hardest men. Somewhere among them was Bill Gardner. Babs didn't wait for someone else to make the first move. He shouted across the crowd, Where's Bill Gardner? The noise around them faded. I want Gardner. It was an extraordinary thing to do. He wasn't hiding within the crowd. He wasn't looking for an easier target. He was calling out the man most associated with West Ham's reputation. According to those present, Gardner answered the challenge and began moving forward himself. For a few brief moments, it appeared inevitable that two of the biggest names in London football hooliganism were about to collide. Then the police intervened. Before either side could reach the other, officers forced the two mobs apart. The confrontation never happened, but in many ways it didn't need to. Simply issuing the challenge told everyone present exactly what sort of man Babs was. That moment became another story, another tale carried home on coaches, another memory repeated in pubs after matches, another piece of the legend. Because on the terraces, reputations weren't always built by what happened. Sometimes they were built by what almost happened. And for one-armed Babs, his legend was only just beginning. If the confrontation with Bill Gardner helped cement Babs's reputation beyond Chelsea, it was the away days that truly turned his name into football folklore. In those days, reputations weren't built at Stamford Bridge. They were built hundreds of miles from home. Anyone could look brave, surrounded by thousands of their own supporters. The real test came on freezing Saturday afternoons in unfamiliar towns where every street, every pub and every railway station belonged to somebody else. For Chelsea, the late 70s and early 80s became a period where every away trip felt like a campaign. It wasn't simply about 90 minutes of football anymore. Supporters travelled expecting confrontation. Every station arrival was watched. Every pub carefully chosen. Every route to the ground calculated. And somewhere within those travelling mobs, one-armed Babs was becoming one of the men everybody recognised. One of the earliest stories to survive comes from Derby. Several Chelsea supporters would later point to that trip as the day Babs truly made his name. At the time, he was often seen wearing a heavy sheepskin coat, a look shared by many lads during that era. Plenty of rival supporters didn't even realise he only had one arm until they were already standing in front of him. One Chelsea supporter remembered it with a smile years later. A lot of people didn't know he only had one arm, but if he hit you with that stump, you'd know about it. Whether remembered with humour or admiration, the story captured something important. Nobody looked at Babs with sympathy. Nobody made excuses for him. If anything, opponents often underestimated him until it was far too late. That became another recurring theme throughout the stories. People noticed the missing arm. Then they forgot about it the moment trouble started. As Chelsea's reputation continued to grow, so too did Babs. Supporters who travelled regularly began recognising the same faces every weekend. Certain men naturally emerged as leaders, not because they appointed themselves, but because others instinctively followed them. Babs was one of those men. One Chelsea supporter who spent years alongside him later described him in remarkably simple terms. His followers would have died for him. It wasn't intended as dramatic exaggeration. It was describing loyalty, the sort of loyalty that cannot be demanded, only earned. Those who travelled with him trusted him, even when the odds looked impossible. Perhaps nowhere illustrates that better than Sunderland. For Chelsea, Sunderland away represented exactly the kind of fixture every travelling firm both anticipated and dreaded. Long journey, hostile city, aggressive local support, and a police force that many London supporters believed treated away fans with open hostility. Before the match, the tension had been building for hours. Chelsea had already been involved in confrontations throughout the city. The home supporters had numbers. The police seemed content to allow local lads far greater freedom than the visitors. According to several eyewitnesses, Sunderland supporters repeatedly attempted to provoke fights, while officers concentrated their attention on Chelsea instead. It created an atmosphere where away supporters felt under siege long before the final whistle. Then the game ended. As thousands of supporters streamed out into the streets surrounding Roker Park, everyone knew the real contest was about to begin. Chelsea supporters began making their way towards the exits. Then somebody spotted him. Babs. Already outside, already standing alone. While many supporters were still filtering through the turnstiles, Babs had positioned himself directly in front of Sunderland's waiting mob. No crowd behind him, no shield. Just one stocky Chelsea supporter facing a sea of home fans. Those present never forgot the sight. One eyewitness later admitted there was something almost unsettling about it. The Sunderland supporters appeared uncertain, not frightened, confused. Standing opposite them was a man with one arm, yet nobody seemed eager to be the first to charge him. Because by now, his reputation had travelled ahead of him. People knew exactly who they were looking at. Within moments, more Chelsea supporters reached his side. The hesitation disappeared. Chelsea surged forward. The Sunderland lads turned and ran. It was only one battle among many that afternoon, but it perfectly captured why Babs had become such a respected figure. He didn't wait until the numbers favoured him. He was already there. The fighting continued for what seemed like miles. Every junction became another confrontation. Every alley, another ambush. Chelsea would force Sunderland back, only for another group of locals to appear further along the route. Gradually, the momentum began shifting. The repeated attacks were taking their toll. Eventually, Sunderland succeeded in splitting the Chelsea firm into smaller groups. Suddenly, the visitors found themselves heavily outnumbered. Punches came from every direction. Supporters were kicked from behind. Men were dragged towards the ground. For the first time that day, Chelsea looked genuinely vulnerable. Yet somehow, amid the chaos, familiar faces began finding one another. Eccles, the Mitcham lads, Danny Harkins, and Babs. Within minutes, almost every recognised Chelsea face had regrouped in one narrow section of road. There were perhaps 50 of them now. Not enough, but enough to stand. Ahead waited hundreds of Sunderland supporters. There was no route around them, only through. The violence that followed became one of the defining stories of Chelsea's second division years. Wave after wave of Sunderland supporters charged forward. Chelsea gave ground. They backed into the mouth of a narrow alley. It wasn't planned, Chelsea held. Nobody ran. Nobody abandoned the line. Then, just as exhaustion began setting in, another roar echoed from behind the Sunderland mob. The rest of Chelsea had regrouped. They attacked from the rear. Caught between two advancing groups, Sunderland finally broke. Years later, one of the Chelsea supporters who survived that afternoon reflected on what had happened. He believed everybody had fought bravely. But two men stood above the rest, Eccles and Babs. Not because they threw the most punches, not because they shouted the loudest, but because they never stopped encouraging those around them. They fought. They organised. They inspired confidence. When younger supporters looked around for reassurance, those were the two faces they found. It wasn't leadership in any official sense. It was something much harder to earn. Trust. The journey home offered little chance to recover. Back at Seaburn Station, battered Chelsea supporters hurried aboard the waiting special train, desperate to secure a seat after one of the toughest away days many could remember. As the train finally pulled away, there was a brief feeling of relief. Then the windows exploded. Bricks smashed through the glass from outside. One landed directly in the middle of a card game that had only just begun. Another reminder that away days rarely ended at the final whistle. Yet despite everything Sunderland had thrown at them, Chelsea returned south, believing they had enhanced their reputation. They had stood their ground. They had survived. And among the names repeatedly mentioned whenever that day was discussed, One-Arm Babs was always near the top of the list. His reputation continued to grow, not through newspaper headlines, not through interviews, but through stories carried from one away end to the next. Stories repeated on coaches, in pubs, on station platforms. Stories that slowly transformed an ordinary Chelsea supporter into one of the most enduring legends the English terraces would ever produce. And if Sunderland proved, Babs could inspire men against overwhelming odds. The trip to Millwall would test whether even legends had their limits. If there was one fixture that could humble even the biggest football firms in England, it was Millwall away. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, Cold Blow Lane had developed an almost mythical reputation. Every major firm in the country claimed to be the hardest. Every club had stories of victories over rivals. But when football supporters spoke privately, away from the bravado and the chants, Millwall was often mentioned differently. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was respect. Chelsea's own lads admitted that, despite their growing reputation, Millwall remained one of the few firms they weren't entirely sure they were ready for. That uncertainty alone says everything about what awaited them. When the day finally arrived, Chelsea's turnout reflected the occasion. Old faces emerged from retirement. Men who hadn't travelled regularly for years suddenly appeared again, sensing this wasn't just another away game. It was a chance to prove something. One of the main groups gathered around Eccles at Fulham Broadway. Babs organised his own rendezvous elsewhere. That detail often gets overlooked, but it tells us something important. By now, Babs wasn't simply travelling with Chelsea. He was leading his own crew, different meeting points, different routes, the same destination. Eventually, hundreds of Chelsea supporters made their way towards Cold Blow Lane. Their confidence lasted only until they reached the stadium. Against all expectations, they entered the Millwall end itself. At first, nothing happened. The terraces looked almost empty. A handful of Millwall supporters watched from a distance. Some Chelsea lads probably thought the stories had been exaggerated. Then everything changed. Almost without warning, supporters began appearing from every entrance, from every staircase, every corner of the ground. Every route seemed to lead towards one place. The Cold Blow Lane end, towards Chelsea. Within minutes, dozens became hundreds. Millwall supporters gathered below them. More appeared on either side. Others came from behind. The police stood by, seemingly content to watch events unfold. One Chelsea supporter would later describe the feeling as the most intimidating atmosphere he had ever experienced at football. Nobody needed to throw a punch. The message had already been delivered. You are in our house. Some Chelsea supporters quietly slipped away. Others climbed back over barriers and left the ground altogether. Without a single serious confrontation, Millwall had already reduced Chelsea's numbers dramatically. Then the fighting began. The pressure came from every direction. Eventually, Chelsea were driven from the end. Later, those involved discovered something remarkable. While Eccles' group had been battling inside the stadium, Babs had entered separately. he had deliberately arrived later. Instead of joining the first assault, he chose to surprise Millwall by bringing his own mob into the ground after events were already unfolding. It was a completely different approach. For a while, it worked. Babs and his lads managed to hold their own until the closing stages. But eventually, they too were overwhelmed. Not because they lacked commitment, simply because Millwall's numbers became impossible to resist. Even decades later, Chelsea supporters remained remarkably honest about that afternoon. They admitted they had been beaten, but they also reminded anyone willing to listen of one important fact. Very few firms ever dared enter Millwall's own end. Chelsea did it twice. 2 different groups, 2 separate assaults. That alone ensured the day became part of football folklore. Like so many famous away days, the stories continued long after the bruises disappeared. Millwall supporters insisted they had ripped off Babs' false arm and thrown it onto the pitch. Those who actually knew him laughed at the suggestion. According to friends and fellow Chelsea supporters, Babs never wore a prosthetic arm on match days. The story simply wasn't true, yet it survived. Because myths often survive longer than facts. In many ways, that rumour perfectly sums up one-arm Babs. The more people talked about him, the bigger the legend became. If Millwall exposed Chelsea's vulnerabilities, Tottenham demonstrated something else entirely. It showed another side of Babs, away from the violence, away from the mythology, the calm confidence. Before the match at White Hart Lane, Chelsea's large travelling firm found itself exchanging insults with Tottenham's recognised faces across a perimeter fence. Among Spurs' leading figures stood Sammy Skives, one of the most respected names in London's football scene. The usual shouting began, accusations, boasting, claims that one side had run earlier in the day. Babs listened, then answered quietly, "You chased a few of our Muppets up the road. The rest of us hadn't even got out of the station." No theatrics, no screaming, just complete confidence. Those standing nearby remembered how difficult it was to provoke him. The louder Tottenham became, the calmer Babs appeared. Eventually, one of the Spurs lads tried another approach. "Pooper going, mate." The implication was obvious. Chelsea were frightened. Babs barely reacted. Chelsea had built their reputation on giving as good as they got verbally as well as physically. Wind-ups rarely worked. If anything, Babs seemed amused. One Chelsea supporter remembered another occasion when Southampton fans stood safely behind police lines, shouting abuse while officers prevented any confrontation. Around him, Chelsea supporters screamed back in frustration. Babs simply smiled. "Come on, boys. You can do better than that." It was a tiny remark, almost insignificant. Yet it reveals something about his personality. Others lost control. Babs rarely did. Eventually, after the Tottenham match, the inevitable confrontation arrived. This time, there were no fences, no barriers, no police between them. A Spurs crew, led by Sammy Skives and other recognised faces, emerged behind Chelsea as they approached Tottenham Hale Station. There was barely a moment's hesitation. Chelsea charged. The sheer force of numbers pushed Tottenham backwards. Within seconds, the police reappeared, bundling both firms apart before the situation escalated further. For Babs, it became another Saturday, another confrontation, another story added to an already growing reputation. Perhaps the most revealing insight into Babs, however, doesn't come from a fight at all. Then everything changed. Almost without warning, supporters began appearing from every entrance, from every staircase, every corner of the ground. Every route seemed to lead towards one place. the Coldblow Lane end, towards Chelsea. Within minutes, dozens became hundreds. Millwall supporters gathered below them. More appeared on either side. Others came from behind. The police stood by, seemingly content to watch events unfold. One Chelsea supporter would later describe the feeling as the most intimidating atmosphere he had ever experienced at football. Nobody needed to throw a punch. The message had already been delivered. You are in our house. Some Chelsea supporters quietly slipped away. Others climbed back over barriers and left the ground altogether. Without a single serious confrontation, Millwall had already reduced Chelsea's numbers dramatically. Then the fighting began. The pressure came from every direction. Eventually, Chelsea were driven from the end. Later, those involved discovered something remarkable. While Eccles's group had been battling inside the stadium, Babs had entered separately. He had deliberately arrived later. Instead of joining the first assault, he chose to surprise Millwall by bringing his own mob into the ground after events were already unfolding. It was a completely different approach. For a while, it worked. Babs and his lads managed to hold their own until the closing stages. But eventually, they too were overwhelmed. Not because they lacked commitment, simply because Millwall's numbers became impossible to resist. Even decades later, Chelsea supporters remained remarkably honest about that afternoon. They admitted they had been beaten. But they also reminded anyone willing to listen of one important fact. Very few firms ever dared enter Millwall's own end. Chelsea did it twice. 2 different groups, 2 separate assaults. That alone ensured the day became part of football folklore. Like so many famous away days, the stories continued long after the bruises disappeared. Millwall supporters insisted they had ripped off Babs' false arm and thrown it onto the pitch. Those who actually knew him laughed at the suggestion. According to friends and fellow Chelsea supporters, Babs never wore a prosthetic arm on match days. The story simply wasn't true, yet it survived. Because myths often survive longer than facts. In many ways, that rumour perfectly sums up one-armed Babs. The more people talked about him, the bigger the legend became. If Millwall exposed Chelsea's vulnerabilities, Tottenham demonstrated something else entirely. It showed another side of Babs. Away from the violence, away from the mythology. The calm confidence. Before the match at White Hart Lane, Chelsea's large travelling firm found itself exchanging insults with Tottenham's recognised faces across a perimeter fence. Among Spurs' leading figures stood Sammy Skives, one of the most respected names in London's football scene. The usual shouting began, accusations, boasting, claims that one side had run earlier in the day. Babs listened, then answered quietly, "You chased a few of our Muppets up the road. The rest of us hadn't even got out of the station. No theatrics, no screaming, just complete confidence." Those standing nearby remembered how difficult it was to provoke him. The louder Tottenham became, the calmer Babs appeared. Eventually, one of the Spurs lads tried another approach. "Pooper are going, mate." The implication was obvious. Chelsea were frightened. Babs barely reacted. Chelsea had built their reputation on giving as good as they got verbally as well as physically. Wind-ups rarely worked. If anything, Babs seemed amused. One Chelsea supporter remembered another occasion when Southampton fans stood safely behind police lines, shouting abuse, while officers prevented any confrontation. Around him, Chelsea supporters screamed back in frustration. Babs simply smiled. "Come on, boys. You can do better than that." It was a tiny remark, almost insignificant. Yet it reveals something about his personality. Others lost control. Babs rarely did. Eventually, after the Tottenham match, the inevitable confrontation arrived. This time, there were no fences, no barriers, no police between them. A Spurs crew, led by Sammy Skives and other recognised faces, emerged behind Chelsea as they approached Tottenham Hale Station. There was barely a moment's hesitation. Chelsea charged. The sheer force of numbers pushed Tottenham backwards. Within seconds, the police reappeared, bundling both firms apart before the situation escalated further. For Babs, it became another Saturday. Another confrontation, another story added to an already growing reputation. Perhaps the most revealing insight into Babs, however, doesn't come from a fight at all. It comes from the men who followed him. One confrontation at a time. One witness telling another. And somehow, year after year, Babs' name kept resurfacing. Not because he sought publicity, but because somebody always seemed to have another story. One of those stories came from Wolverhampton. By this point, Chelsea's firm had become one of the most feared travelling mobs in the country. But even among Chelsea's own supporters, there was a noticeable distinction between Eccles's followers and those who travelled with Babs. One eyewitness would later make an observation that perfectly summed up the difference. Eccles, he believed, was a pragmatist. He loved organisation, planning, executing, winning. If the odds looked impossible, Eccles often preferred to regroup and find another opportunity. Babs was different. According to those beside him, his crew seemed prepared to walk straight into situations others might avoid. That difference became obvious at Molineux. Chelsea entered Wolverhampton's home end. For most football firms, that alone would have been considered enough. For Wolves supporters, it was the ultimate insult. They responded exactly as expected, violently. The retaliation was immediate and ferocious. Yet those present remembered one thing above everything else. Babs' lads never folded. Whatever happened around them, they continued pressing forward. It wasn't necessarily about winning every confrontation. It was about refusing to be intimidated. That attitude, more than anything else, became the foundation of Babs' reputation. Not invincibility, resolve. One account from the same trip reveals another side of those years. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't legendary. It was ugly. Chelsea supporters had travelled overnight, sleeping in shop doorways before the cafes opened for breakfast. As dawn broke, an ordinary working man walked towards his job carrying his lunchbox. He had absolutely nothing to do with football, nothing to do with hooliganism. Yet one Chelsea supporter, looking for trouble where none existed, barged into him before punching him without provocation. The man turned in confusion. What was that for? Before realising dozens of football supporters were now beginning to surround him. Stories like these matter because they remind us that football hooliganism wasn't some romantic adventure. It wasn't a film. It wasn't a game. Too often, completely innocent people found themselves caught in situations they neither understood nor deserved. For every organised confrontation between rival firms, there were moments like this that revealed the darker side of the culture. Ignoring those moments would paint an incomplete picture. The legend of One-Arm Babs exists within that world. It cannot be separated from it. As the years passed, Babs' reputation spread even further. It wasn't just rival firms who recognised him anymore. Leading figures from other clubs knew him personally. One story tells of a tense afternoon when a handful of Chelsea lads found themselves standing outside a pub alongside Millwall supporters. Only a solitary police officer stood nearby. Then came unexpected news. Around 500 members of West Ham's intercity firm appeared. The atmosphere instantly changed. For a few nervous moments, everyone expected the worst. Instead, something surprising happened. Leading the West Ham contingent was Natalie, one of the ICF's recognised names. He looked towards the Chelsea group, laughed, shrugged, and carried on walking. Why? Because he knew who they were. More importantly, he knew Babs. The two had reportedly shared drinks together in Chelsea on previous occasions. That single moment says something fascinating about football's old firms. The rivalries were genuine, the violence was real. But away from match days, many of the leading figures knew one another remarkably well. They respected each other's reputations, even if they fought on Saturdays. It's a reminder that the terrace world was often far more complicated than outsiders imagined. Another story places Babs at Leicester years later. By then, football was changing. Following major police operations and lengthy court cases against prominent hooligans, many believed the worst years were finally ending. Some older faces even returned to football expecting everything to have calmed down. For a while, it appeared they had. Chelsea and Leicester supporters stood drinking together in pubs. Scarves were exchanged, stories shared. Some wondered whether football violence had finally become a thing of the past. Then the match began. Chelsea scored. Almost instantly, Leicester supporters crossed the flimsy rope separating the two sets of fans and attacked. Panic spread. People scattered over seats. Old habits returned almost immediately. It was a reminder that, although English football was changing, the culture that had produced figures like Babs had not disappeared overnight. It was slowly fading, not vanishing. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about one-armed Babs is not the stories themselves. It's how remarkably consistent they remain across books, across fan forums, across eyewitness accounts, across rival supporters, across decades. Different people remember different fights, different away days, different conversations, yet they almost always describe the same man. A stocky Chelsea supporter, always immaculately turned out, friendly away from football, calm under pressure, loyal to his mates, and utterly fearless when trouble arrived. Even the small personal memories tell their own story. One supporter remembered meeting Babs in Vienna. He'd heard all the stories beforehand. When they finally met, he was a lovely bloke. Another remembered seeing him years later at a hospital in Hastings while visiting his newborn son. Babs wasn't there because of football. He was visiting his brother. Just another ordinary family moment. Others simply described him in the same straightforward way. Top geezer. Sometimes those two words tell you more than an entire biography, because perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. For someone remembered as one of Chelsea's most feared hooligans, the people who actually knew him rarely began by talking about violence. They talked about the man. Unfortunately, that is also where the trail largely disappears. We still don't know exactly how Babs lost his arm. We don't know much about his early life. We know little about his family. There are no lengthy interviews explaining his version of events. No autobiography, very few photographs, almost no public record. History often remembers those who leave documents behind. Football remembers those who leave stories. And that is exactly what happened here. Whether standing alone against Sunderland, calling out Bill Gardner, leading his own crew into Millwall, trading jokes across the fence at White Hart Lane, or earning the respect of men who spent decades on opposing terraces. One-armed Babs became something much larger than the man himself. He became folklore. Today, younger football supporters know names like Cass Pennant, Bill Gardner, and Mickey Francis because books, documentaries, and interviews preserved their stories. Babs took a different route into football history. His legacy survived because thousands of supporters kept talking about him in pubs, on coaches, on internet forums, in old memoirs, and in the memories of those fortunate or unfortunate enough to stand opposite him on a Saturday afternoon. Perhaps that's why the legend has never really disappeared. Not because we know everything about one-armed Babs, but because we don't. The unanswered questions have become part of the story. The missing details have allowed the myths to grow. And somewhere between the confirmed facts and the terrace folklore stands the image that has endured for almost half a century. A stocky Chelsea supporter, smartly dressed, standing calmly at the front of the mob, one arm by his side, refusing to take a backward step. For many, that is all they ever needed to know. Thank you to my viewers and friends that send me pictures and videos. If you have a story to tell and would like to stay anonymous, you can message me on Facebook. Just type in everything casual and my page will pop up. Feel free to message me and join our community on there. This channel is all about sharing stories and keeping memories alive. Thank you for watching. See you next time.